My family began to despise me when they discovered the truth. I wasn't my father's daughter. What if your whole life was built on a lie? Not a small, innocent one, but a fundamental betrayal that turned you into a pariah in your own home? One night, when I was just 10 years old, a secret exploded, and I suddenly became the problem my parents wished they could just crop out of the family picture. Looking at my life now, most people would probably say my childhood seemed fine. On paper, at least. And honestly, that's become the running joke of my whole life. We had a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, the bills were always paid, and there was always food on the table for those picture-perfect moments and holidays. My parents, they loved telling anyone who'd listen that they were raising strong kids with good values. From the outside, we looked like one of those generic families from a picture frame you buy at the store. But no one could see that I was the part of that picture everyone inside the house wanted to delete. Back then, I didn't know there was a secret. I just thought my father was strict, my mother was anxious, and my brothers were mean in the way brothers usually are. I did my homework, I tried to get good grades. I stayed out of trouble as much as I could. I told myself that if I just behaved perfectly, things at home would stay at least predictable. I was 10 the night that lie shattered everything. I remember I was sitting on my bedroom floor, coloring in this little notebook I kept hidden under my bed, when the yelling started downstairs. And this wasn't the normal bickering. Not the sharp voice my mother used when my father forgot to take out the trash. No, this was something else entirely. This deep, guttural kind of shouting that made my chest tighten before I even understood the words. At first, I tried to ignore it. That was the rule, right? Kids didn't get involved in adult issues. But the volume just kept going up, and then my name, suddenly came flying up the stairs, attached to a sentence that didn't sound real. I heard my father bellow that I wasn't his, that I was proof my mother had cheated on him, that he'd wasted 10 years raising someone else's mistake. I froze, so hard, my hand cramped around the marker. My mother screamed back that it was complicated, that it had been one stupid night, that she thought the other man was gone, that she was sorry. I didn't understand half of it. All I caught was that my existence was now officially a problem everyone wished they could just delete. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to them tear each other apart. Time got weird. At some point, my younger brother started crying because the noise scared him, and my older brother was yelling too, asking what was happening. My father just shouted at both of them to be quiet, because he had been lied to his whole life. My name kept getting tossed around like a dirty word. When my door finally opened, my mother stood there, her eyes red, her face washed out in a way I had never seen. She looked at me like she didn't know who she was looking at. My father walked past her, glanced at me once, and something just switched off in his face. That was the last day I remember him looking at me like I was actually his daughter. If you've never watched somebody decide they're done with you, while you're still standing right in front of them, I honestly hope you never do. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's a tiny click somewhere in their eyes. And after that, every interaction is different. The next morning, my bowl at breakfast was smaller. My father didn't ask about school. When I tried to hug my mother in the kitchen, she flinched like I was a hot stove. She didn't yell. She just moved away. She told me she was busy, that she had a headache, that we'd talk later. We never did. The rules shifted fast after that. Things my brothers always did, leaving their shoes in the hallway, forgetting to turn off the lights, suddenly became my fault. If a chore wasn't done, it was because I hadn't done it, or because I hadn't reminded them. My father stopped using my name. He just called me that girl. When family friends came over, I was told to stay in my room or help in the kitchen while my brothers sat on the couch, playing games. At first, my brothers were confused, too. They still tried to drag me into their rough little games. But every time they did, my father would snap that they didn't need to waste time with me. Kids are fast learners. It didn't take long before they decided I wasn't worth the trouble. By the time I turned 11, I was doing pretty much every chore in the house. Laundry, dishes, floors, bathroom, backyard, you name it. My brothers would leave plates with food crusted on them, and my parents would call me from my room to clean them right away, no matter what I was doing. My clothes were hand-me-downs that had already gone through both of them. And when I showed up at school in pants that were too short and a shirt with a stain that wouldn't come out, I just laughed it off when other kids made comments. What was I supposed to say? That my father refused to buy me anything new, because why should I spend money on someone who isn't mine? Yeah, no. That doesn't exactly fit into normal cafeteria conversation. I know it sounds dramatic, but the part that messed me up the most wasn't even the physical stuff at first. It was the way the house changed temperature depending on who I was around. If my brothers broke something, my father would look at me and ask why I hadn't stopped them. If my mother miscounted the grocery budget, she'd snap that it was my fault because I ate too much cereal. I started shrinking myself, moving quieter, breathing softer, hoping that if I occupied less space, they would forget I was there. Spoiler alert, they didn't. They just found new ways to make sure I knew exactly how unwanted I was. Then came the basement. We didn't call it a basement. We called it downstairs storage when I was little, like it was just a place where old furniture went to die. After the truth came out, it turned into my main address whenever my father decided I'd screwed up. The first time he locked me down there overnight, I was 13. I'd forgotten to switch the laundry from the washer to the dryer, and a load of his shirts smelled musty. He grabbed me by the arm, dragged me down the stairs, shoved me inside, and clicked the lock while I was still trying to apologize. It was cold, smelled like damp concrete and dust, and the only light was this weak bulb that buzzed like it was annoyed to be there, too. I sat on an old blanket and told myself it was just for a few hours, that in the morning things would be fine again. Then I heard the television upstairs and my brothers laughing and my mother telling them to keep it down. Not because of me, but because the neighbors might hear. I cried quietly for a while, and then stopped because even the sound of my own sobbing made me nervous that he would come back and be mad I wasn't being grateful enough. I started scratching tiny marks into the wall with a nail I found, just to keep track of how many times I was sent down there and how long it lasted. It felt like the only thing I had any control over. Those nights in the basement got longer. First it was a few hours, then a whole night, then weekends. If I burned dinner, basement. If my brothers fought and one of them got hurt, basement. If my mother cried and my father needed someone to blame, basement. I thought about running away so many times I lost count. I'd imagine grabbing my backpack, sneaking out the back door, walking until my legs gave out, finding some kind stranger who would take me in. But every time I stood in front of the back door for real, with my hand on the knob, I'd hear my father's voice in my head talking about what happens to girls who run away, how no one wants them, how they end up in situations worse than anything they could imagine. I didn't know if he was right. I just knew I was too scared to test it. Things kept getting worse in small, ugly steps until one afternoon when everything went from bad to absolutely insane. I was 15, washing dishes after dinner. My hands were pruned and I was tired, but there were still pots left in the sink because my mother had decided she was too exhausted to cook and had left everything to me. One pan slipped out of my soapy hands and a glass on the counter tipped over and smashed on the floor. The sound of it breaking felt like a gunshot in that quiet kitchen. I froze because of course I did. Within seconds, my father stormed in like I had set the house on fire. He started yelling about how I couldn't do anything right, how even the simplest tasks were too much for me, how I was ungrateful and useless. Something in me snapped before I could stop it. Maybe it was all the nights in the basement. Maybe it was being blamed for everything since I was 10. Maybe it was just the wrong day. I looked at my mother who was standing in the doorway, and I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I didn't cheat on anyone. I didn't lie to anyone. I didn't ask to be born. You two did all of that, and somehow I'm the only one being punished. The room went silent, in that thick, electric way where you know you just crossed a line you can never uncross. I wish I could tell you I stood my ground and delivered some epic speech. But what actually happened is that my father's face twisted into this expression I'd never seen before, and he lunged at me. He shoved me so hard I hit the counter. And then my mother started yelling at me too, calling me disrespectful, saying I didn't understand what I had done to their marriage just by existing. My older brother came in shouting that everybody needed to calm down, but he grabbed my arm too hard, trying to break it up. And my younger brother was crying and pushing at me, like somehow this was my fault for making things worse. It wasn't one clean hit. It was this chaotic mess of hands and shoves and someone pulling my hair and somebody else kicking my leg when I slipped on the broken glass. There's a point where your body just kind of checks out. I curled in on myself on the floor, trying to cover my head while people I shared a bathroom with pounded years of resentment into my shoulders and back and stomach. I really thought in this weird, detached way that this was how it was going to end. On the kitchen floor that I had just mopped, surrounded by soap bubbles and shards of my own life. Then there was a burst of cold air and someone yelling from outside. And for a second, I thought I was imagining it until I realized the front door was open and the neighbor from across the street was shouting my name. He had heard the screaming and came over. He saw me on the floor, bleeding from somewhere I couldn't even pinpoint, and my father standing over me. The neighbors started yelling to call for help. My father tried to spin some story about me acting out, but people were already coming out of their houses, because apparently when it's your own kid, that kind of noise finally gets attention. I remember trying to stand up, my legs shaking, my vision going all spotty around the edges, and then everything just sort of folded in on itself. The last thing I heard was somebody saying she's just a kid before everything went black. Waking up in a hospital bed after something like that is surreal. You don't open your eyes and feel grateful to be alive. At least I didn't. I woke up and my first thought was that I was going to be in so much trouble for making a scene. My face hurt, my ribs hurt, breathing hurt. There were bruises on my arms that looked like fingerprints. A nurse came over and spoke softly, called me sweetheart, adjusted my blanket. I didn't know what to do with that kind of gentleness. I just stared at her like she was speaking another language. Then a police officer came in, and behind him there was a woman with a folder who introduced herself as a social worker. The officer took pictures of my injuries, documenting everything with this quiet, focused energy, and the woman asked me questions about what had happened at home. At first, I tried to downplay it, old habits. I said we fought sometimes, that my father could be strict, that I had fallen. They had already talked to the neighbors, though. They had already seen the kitchen, the broken glass, the blood on the floor. They knew I had been locked in the basement before, because one of the neighbors' kids had told their mother about the girl downstairs, and the mother had mentioned it to the social worker when she showed up. Piece by piece, the story came out. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough for them to say I wasn't going back there. Enough for them to tell me my parents were in custody. Enough for them to explain that there would be hearings and assessments, and that for now I was going into the system. The system, like that was just a normal place you could go, like the grocery store or school. I nodded like I understood. Inside, I felt like someone had cut all the strings that had been holding me up, and I was just waiting to see where I landed. The first house they took me to belonged to this older woman who had been taking in kids for years. The place was a little worn, the furniture mismatched, but it was clean, and it didn't smell like anger. She showed me a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that actually opened. She laid out the rules in a firm but straightforward way. Keep your space tidy, be home by curfew, be respectful. Then she handed me a set of pajamas and told me there were leftovers in the fridge if I was hungry. I waited for the catch. I waited for some hint that all of this was going to turn into another punishment, but it didn't. One night, a few weeks in, I woke up in the middle of the night with my stomach growling. Old fear wrapped around my throat automatically. Back home, eating outside of approved mealtimes was a guaranteed trip to the basement. I lay there for a while, trying to will myself back to sleep, but the hunger wouldn't let me. Finally, I crept down the hall into the kitchen, moving like a burglar in my own life. I opened the pantry as quietly as I could and reached for a box of cereal, planning to pour a handful into my hand and eat it dry in the dark. I was halfway through shoving the cereal into my mouth when I realized no one was coming. No footsteps on the stairs. No angry voice. Just the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I flipped on the light, poured a bowl, added milk from the fridge, and sat at the table, shaking while I ate. I cried over that stupid cereal because it was the first time in years I had eaten without feeling like I needed permission to exist. That's the kind of thing trauma does to you. It takes something basic like food and turns it into a negotiation. The woman who ran the house wasn't exactly warm. She didn't really do hugs or deep talks, but she didn't hit me. She didn't lock doors on me, and she didn't call me names. That was enough to start rewiring my brain a little bit. I went to school. I came back. I did chores like every other kid in the house, and no one treated me like I was poisoned. I started to think maybe, just maybe, I could have a life that didn't revolve around trying not to get hurt. Then her health started to fail. I noticed because she got winded going up the stairs, and because the pill bottles on the counter multiplied. The social worker started visiting more often, asking if everything was okay. One afternoon, the woman sat me down and explained that she had to stop taking kids in. She could barely take care of herself, let alone a house full of teenagers with more baggage than closets. She told me it wasn't my fault, that she was proud of how hard I was working, that she believed I would be okay. I nodded and thanked her, but inside, it felt like the floor was opening up again. The next place was a couple who had just joined the program. They were younger, didn't have kids of their own, and at first I thought maybe this would be a real family situation. They had a nice house, new furniture, everything arranged like it had been pulled from a catalog. They explained the house rules, gave me a list of chores, and told me I had my own room. They also kept this invisible wall up around themselves. They were polite but distant. They asked about my grades, but not how I was actually doing. They made dinner and set a plate for me, but we didn't talk much at the table. A few months in, I came home early from school because a teacher conference had ended ahead of schedule. As I walked past the kitchen, I heard them talking. They didn't know I was there. The woman said she was exhausted from dealing with all the drama, and that she didn't realize teenagers from the system came with so much emotional maintenance. The man said at least the monthly check helped with the mortgage, and that maybe next time they should ask for younger kids, ones who would be grateful and not so complicated. I stood in the hallway, listening to two adults discuss me like I was a project that had gone over budget. I'll be honest, that conversation did something to me. It didn't surprise me exactly, but it confirmed this ugly little belief I already had, that I was fundamentally too much. Too much work, too much damage, too much history. That night, I went to a meeting at a community center where a counselor handed out pamphlets about trauma support services for young adults. I took one, folded it into a tiny square, and hid it inside my notebook. I made myself a promise that if I ever got out of the system and had even a little bit of control over my life, I would find my own therapist and figure my brain out whether anyone helped me or not. It didn't take long for that couple to call the social worker and say they wanted me moved. They used nice words about how they felt ill-equipped and needed a different placement fit, but the message was clear. They had signed up for something that looked good on paper and decided the human part was too messy. The third house was the one that almost broke me. On the surface, it looked ideal. A married couple with a good reputation, a clean house, other kids who seemed quiet but functional. The social workers spoke highly of them, said they were very organized, very experienced. Organized turned out to mean controlling. Experienced turned out to mean they knew exactly how to play the system. From the first day, everything was about rules. How you folded your clothes, how long your showers could be, what time you could use the bathroom in the morning, how many slices of bread you were allowed with dinner. They took me to the bathroom and shaved my head because of a lice outbreak in your last placement, even though nobody had mentioned any outbreak. It was about control. It was about making sure we all knew we didn't own anything, not even our hair. Food became a currency. They locked the pantry and kept the key on a chain around the woman's neck. If you annoyed them, your portion got smaller. If you questioned something, you lost privileges. When the caseworkers came by for inspections, the couple put on this wholesome performance, smiling, talking about how they were like a big family. And their favorite line was that they believed in tough love. We were warned that if we said anything negative, they would tell everyone we were violent, ungrateful, unstable, and that we would be sent somewhere much worse. They talked about those homes in this vague, terrifying way that made staying put feel like the only option. So I lied. When the social worker asked me how things were, I smiled and said everything was fine. I showed her my good grades, talked about how I was focusing on school. I didn't mention that I went to bed hungry more nights than not, or that the couple used humiliation as a sport. That was the deal. I pretended everything was okay, and in exchange, I got to keep my spot at the small desk in the corner, the bed that was technically mine, and a schedule I could predict. In those last few years before I aged out, I clung hard to the idea of time. I knew that once I turned 18, they couldn't keep me there. I picked up part-time jobs wherever I could, at a small grocery store, at a diner bussing tables, even cleaning offices on weekends. Every little paycheck went into a savings account I opened with the help of a guidance counselor who had quietly decided to become the adult I didn't have at home. I didn't have big dreams. I wasn't imagining college or some glamorous life. My vision was simple, a room with a door that only I had the key to. When I turned 18, I packed everything I owned into 2 trash bags and a suitcase. A couple of the other kids hugged me and told me to keep in touch. The couple who ran the house gave me a stiff handshake and a generic card about new beginnings. I walked out of that house and did not look back. I got on a bus and rode it across a few state lines, watching the places I had known shrink in the rearview mirror. I picked a mid-sized city where I didn't know anyone, mostly because the rent was barely affordable, and there was a bus line that went to the industrial park where I had heard there were always entry-level jobs available. My name is Renee, by the way. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but honestly, learning to say my own name without flinching took a while. When I got to the new city, I walked into the first staffing agency I found and said I would take whatever they had. Within a week, I was working as an office assistant at a logistics company, filing papers, answering phones, making coffee, sitting in on meetings I barely understood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. They paid me every 2 weeks, and no one raised a hand to me when I made a mistake. That felt like a miracle. I rented a tiny room in a shabby house with peeling paint and a landlord who spoke in short sentences, but always fixed things when they broke. The first night I slept there, I pushed my dresser in front of the door out of habit. After a while, I stopped doing that. I started therapy at a low-cost clinic, using that crumpled pamphlet as my starting point. The therapist asked questions that made me want to crawl out of my skin, but she also believed me, and that was new. She didn't try to convince me my parents meant well. She called what happened abuse without hesitating. The years blurred together in this slow, steady way. I got promoted at work. I moved from the tiny room into a studio apartment where the bathroom was actually inside my unit instead of down the hall. I bought furniture that wasn't from the curb. I signed up for night classes at a community college to learn some basic bookkeeping, thinking maybe I could move into a better position one day. I went to the gym a few times a week because my therapist said moving my body might help me untangle some of the panic that still lived under my skin. By the time I hit 30, my life looked normal from the outside. Honestly, it felt almost normal from the inside, too. On good days, I had a small circle of friends from work, people who invited me to birthday dinners and happy hours and game nights. I had a routine. Work, gym, night class, pizza on the couch, sleep, repeat. Once in a while, I went on dates. Nothing serious, mostly because I didn't really know how to let anyone get close without waiting for them to turn on me. My friends told me I was too guarded. I told them I was fine. We were all a little right. I hadn't seen or heard from my family in years. I knew from one short conversation with a social worker before I left the system that my parents had done some time and eventually been released. Part of their sentence involved mandatory counseling and a lot of community service. There was talk of probation, of them having to prove they were rehabilitated. I remember nodding like it had something to do with me, but I had already mentally signed the papers that said I was done with them. I moved states, partly to keep that way. So, when I first noticed a man with a baseball cap outside my office building, I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late fall, getting colder, and people wore hats and hoodies and stood around staring at their phones all the time. He was leaning against a lamppost across the street, looking down at his phone like everyone else. I only noticed him because every time I glanced out the window, he seemed to still be there. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was playing some silly game on his phone. I tried to let it go. A few days later, I saw him again. This time on the bus I took home. Same cap, same jacket, same way of holding his phone, slightly tilted, like he wanted to angle the camera without making it obvious. I got that crawling feeling between my shoulder blades, the one that had kept me alive in that house growing up. It's like an emotional smoke alarm. You can ignore it, but you probably shouldn't. When I got off the bus, he got off too. I slowed down. He slowed down. I sped up. He sped up. That was the moment I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. I turned around abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk and looked straight at him. His eyes flicked up, met mine for half a second, and then he turned and bolted in the opposite direction. He didn't say a word. He just ran. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I walked home fast, locked my door, and sat on the floor with my back against it like a kid. My brain went straight to the worst-case scenario. What if this was connected to my family? What if they had somehow found me after all this time? I had let my old restraining order expire because I thought we were done with each other. I didn't want to see my name and theirs in the same sentence ever again, even on legal paper. That, as it turned out, was not my smartest decision. The next morning, I went to the police station. I felt ridiculous explaining that a man with a cap had maybe taken pictures of me and that he had run away when I confronted him. I could see the officer trying to be polite while also clearly thinking it might just be a misunderstanding. I mentioned my history, that I had been removed from my home as a minor for severe abuse, that my parents had been convicted, that there had been a restraining order. That got his attention a little more. He took notes, told me to write down every time I saw anything suspicious, and gave me the contact information for a local victim support service. I walked out feeling half safer and half like I had just opened a door I had been holding shut with my whole body. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but then about a week later, somebody knocked on my apartment door in the early evening. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends always texted first. I looked through the peephole and almost threw up. Standing there was one of my younger brothers, older now, obviously, but there was no mistaking his face. It was like seeing a ghost who had aged in real time. He said my name through the door, all soft like we were still kids, and he was asking if I wanted to play. My whole body went cold. I didn't open the door. I told him to step back from it, and I asked what he wanted. He said he had driven a long way to talk, that he wasn't here to hurt me, that he just wanted to explain something. He started talking about how they had all changed, how they had found religion in a new way, how they were part of this very intense church community now that believed in redemption and restoration. He said, "My parents were remorseful." He actually used that word remorseful like he had memorized it from a brochure. He said they needed to make amends, not just for themselves, but because people in their church knew about the situation and it was affecting how people saw them. Apparently, there was talk of leadership positions and testimonies and all this image management nonsense, and having an unforgiving daughter out there didn't fit the narrative. I wish I were making that up. He also mentioned, like it was nothing, that they had some paperwork they wanted me to sign. Something about a family agreement, about there being no hard feelings about us all moving forward. Oh, and they wanted a picture. A picture of us hugging, of course, to post on the church's bulletin board or newsletter or whatever, so they could show everyone that forgiveness had done its magic trick. He kept saying it would mean so much to them, that it would help them move on, that it would help their reputation. He didn't say one word about how any of this would help me. While he was standing there giving me this speech through my own door, I noticed the way he was holding his phone, just like the guy with the cap, slightly angled, not quite at his face, pointed toward the peephole area. That nasty little survival alarm in my chest started screaming. I realized he was probably recording, either to capture my reaction or to use my voice for something later. I don't know. I just knew I was done being a prop in their story. So I did something that would have gotten me dragged to the basement as a kid. I told him no, not maybe. Not, I'll think about it. Just no. I told him I was recording too, and I actually pulled out my phone and started a video. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady, which honestly impressed even me. I said on camera that I remembered every time they had locked me downstairs, every time I had been hit, every time my mother had looked away. I listed things he had done too, the times he had shoved me, laughed when my father punished me, called me names. I could hear him breathing heavier on the other side of the door. He tried to cut in, saying I was exaggerating, that I was making it sound worse than it was, that I was making them look like monsters. I told him if he didn't leave, I would send the video straight to the police along with his little speech about reputation and church and paperwork. There was a long pause. Then he called me ungrateful, because of course he did, and said I was choosing bitterness over healing. I told him he was choosing optics over accountability. Then I heard his footsteps going down the hallway. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the light on and sat on the couch with a mug of tea that went cold in my hands. Every creak in the building made me jump. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay there. It was my apartment, my lease, my life. But if they had found this address, they could come back anytime. And I believed him when he said they were invested in the way they looked to other people. People like that don't let go easily. I called my landlord and told him as much of the truth as I could get out without breaking down. I told him my family had found me after years, that there was a history of violence, that I had a video of my brother at my door trying to push me into signing something, that I was terrified they would show up again. He surprised me. He didn't tell me I was overreacting or that it wasn't his problem. Instead, he asked if I had documentation. I sent him copies of the original court records. I still had the hospital photos, the information from the social worker, the police report I had filed about the man with the cap, and a clip of the video at my door. He called me back and said he had checked with a tenants' rights organization. In our state, there were protections for victims of domestic violence that allowed them to break a lease without penalty if staying put was unsafe. He told me he would sign whatever forms I needed. He even offered to write a letter for the next landlord, explaining that I had to move quickly for safety reasons, not because I was irresponsible. I cried after that call, not out of sadness, but because someone in a position of power had chosen to help instead of hurt. It was a new experience. Moving like that, basically overnight, is expensive. I didn't have enough in savings to cover a new deposit, the first month of rent, and all the little fees that pop up out of nowhere. When I told two of my closest coworkers what was going on, they didn't hesitate. They showed up with boxes and tape, helped me pack, and when they realized I was short on cash, they quietly covered part of the deposit as a loan with no deadline. One of them actually said, "You don't have to pay me back until it doesn't feel like survival money anymore." People underestimate how healing that kind of sentence can be. In the middle of all that chaos, I went back to the police and filed for a new protective order. This one named every single member of my family of origin, not just my parents. I handed over the video of my brother at my door, my statement about the man with the cap, and everything from the old case. The officers took it seriously this time. Maybe it was the documentation. Maybe it was the way my hand shook, even though my voice was steady. Either way, they moved faster than I expected. Within a couple of weeks, I had a fresh order in my hands that said in legal language that these people were not allowed to come near me, my home, my workplace, or my friends. I found a new apartment across town in a building with better security and neighbors who actually paid attention to who came and went. I didn't give anyone my address unless I trusted them with my life. I updated my information at work, but asked them not to change my public records. I got a post office box for anything that needed a mailing address that was not my actual home. It felt paranoid and exhausting, but also like putting locks on doors that should have had them years ago. For a little while, things were quiet. I went back to my routines, though everything felt slightly tilted. I checked over my shoulder more. I scanned crowds for familiar faces. I carried pepper spray in my pocket and my phone in my hand. My therapist and I spent entire sessions just talking about safety plans and grounding exercises for when the panic hit out of nowhere. I told my friends they were allowed to think I was overreacting, as long as they helped keep an eye out anyway. Then one afternoon, I was at work, sitting at my desk answering emails, when one of my coworkers came over looking tense. She said there were two men standing across the street, staring at the building, and she thought I might want to know. My stomach dropped. I went to the window and peeked out from behind the blinds. There they were, my brothers. The older one who had technically saved the younger kids by taking temporary custody all those years ago, and the one who had been at my door. I didn't go outside. I didn't confront them. I stayed where I was and told my supervisor, who did exactly what I needed him to do. He called the police. While we waited, my coworkers took turns watching through the window, describing what the brothers were doing. They were pacing, looking at the entrance, checking their phones. When the officers pulled up, the brothers tried to walk away like they had just been taking a stroll. It didn't work. The officers stopped them, checked their IDs, and then checked the system. The restraining order popped up like a neon sign. The brothers tried to say they were just in the area, that it was a coincidence, that they hadn't known I worked there. The officers didn't buy it. They found on the older brother's phone a bunch of photos of me taken over the past few weeks. In front of my old apartment, walking from the bus stop leaving the gym, standing outside the office building. Somehow seeing those photos was almost worse than the beating in the kitchen. It meant they had been watching me live a life I had built from scratch, treating it like a show they could turn on whenever they wanted. The officers arrested them for violating the order and stalking. My coworkers stood with me while I gave my statement again, this time in a conference room that usually hosted budget meetings. It felt surreal, talking about the basement and the glass and the hospital in the same room where we had once argued about office snack budgets. But that is real life, right? The worst things don't happen on dramatic stages. They happen between spreadsheets and coffee breaks. After that, my friends refused to let me walk to my car alone. One of them, along with his girlfriend, made it a whole routine. Every evening, we would leave together, walk to the parking lot, and wait until I was locked in my car and driving away before they left. If I had to work late, they stayed late too. We started calling it the escort service as a dark joke. But underneath the humor was the solid layer of care I didn't quite know how to accept without crying. You would think that would have been enough to scare my family off. Arrests, charges, a clear message that the law was not on their side this time. You would be wrong. A few weeks later, on a night that had been long but otherwise normal, my friends followed me home as usual. They parked on the street in front of my building while I went inside. I locked the door, dropped my bag by the couch, and was just about to text them a quick thank you when the knocking started. It was not polite knocking. It was loud, insistent, the kind that makes your heart jump before your brain catches up. I peeked through the peephole and almost stopped breathing. It wasn't just my brothers this time. It was the whole set. My father, my mother, both brothers. All of them lined up on the walkway of my apartment building like some twisted family portrait. My mother was crying already. My father had that hard-set jaw he always got before he punished someone. And the brothers looked angry, not sorry. They were not supposed to be there. The restraining order made that very clear. I backed away from the door, grabbed my phone, and called the emergency line while they kept pounding and shouting my name. They started with the soft lines, "We just want to talk," and "Be reasonable." But it escalated fast into accusations. They yelled that I was ruining their lives, that I was exaggerating, that I was turning family issues into legal drama. They said I was being used by outsiders who didn't understand our culture, which was a wild way to describe the culture of locking a child in a basement. Meanwhile, my friends in the car had seen them arrive. They started recording from outside, filming the whole scene from their angle. One of them called the emergency line, too, giving a description of the situation and reminding the dispatcher about the restraining order. At some point, one of my brothers tried to force the door handle. The lock rattled, and I threw my weight against the door, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if they really decided to break it. I was shaking so hard that my teeth chattered. Then I heard a shout from outside. One of my friends had gotten out of the car, still filming, and told them the police were on the way. My older brother turned on him, tried to grab his phone, and shoved him hard enough that he stumbled and hit the pavement. I could hear the thud even through the door. My friend swore later that he was fine, and he really was physically okay. But that moment is burned into my brain. Watching someone hurt the person who is trying to protect, you will do that. There was the sound of glass breaking somewhere down the walkway, and I honestly don't know if they threw something or if they smashed a light fixture by accident. The whole thing felt like a scene from a nightmare, except it was my front door and my real life, and there was no waking up. The operator stayed on the line with me, asking me to keep talking, to keep describing what I could see and hear, to stay away from the door. I kept my back pressed against it anyway. Old habits die hard. The sirens eventually cut through the yelling. Red and blue lights flashed against my living room walls like some twisted party. The shouting outside turned into a mix of protest and denial as officers arrived, separated everyone, and started asking questions. One officer knocked on my door, identified himself, and told me it was safe to open up. I did, very slowly, and he asked if I was hurt. I said no, but my voice cracked on the word. They arrested my family on the spot. Violating a protective order is one thing. Showing up in a group to pound on someone's door, attempting to force your way in, and assaulting one of the witnesses is something else entirely. My parents tried the "we're just concerned parents" angle. My brothers insisted they were there peacefully, until the video from my friends' phones made that lie fall apart in about 5 seconds. The officers were not interested in their church reputation or their version of healing. They were interested in the law. What followed was months of hearings and meetings and more paperwork than I knew what to do with. I got connected with a lawyer through a victim advocacy group, and she was a force of nature. She helped me navigate the criminal cases against my family for the violations, the assault on my friend, and the attempted break-in. She also suggested we consider a civil suit for damages, not just for me, but for the friends who had been dragged into this mess. I don't want to make it sound like court fixed everything. It didn't. Sitting in a courtroom, seeing the people who raised you sitting on the other side of the room, listening to lawyers list out all the worst moments of your childhood like bullet points, is brutal. I had to testify. I had to answer questions from their lawyer that made me feel like I was 16 again, being told I was too dramatic, too sensitive, making things up. The difference this time was that there were photos, reports, records, and videos to back me up. The difference was that I had people sitting behind me in that room who were there because they chose me, not because they were stuck with me. In the end, the outcomes were not perfect, but they were real. My parents had still been on some form of supervised release from their earlier conviction. So, violating the restraining order and being involved in this mess triggered a review. Their release was revoked. They were sent back to prison for a significant chunk of time. My older brother, the one with the photos and the stalking behavior, was convicted of multiple counts and got a sentence that included actual prison time, plus a long probation period afterward with strict conditions. The younger brother got a lighter sentence, but still ended up with a criminal record, and, most importantly for me, a permanent order to stay away. The civil case took longer because of course it did. Eventually, the court ordered them to pay damages to me and to my friends for emotional distress and the financial costs of moving, therapy, and lost work time. It wasn't some movie number that made me rich, but it was enough to matter, enough to pay my friends back with interest, to cover my legal fees, to finally build a cushion in my savings account that felt like security instead of a tiny band-aid on a gaping wound. People sometimes assume that getting that money and those court orders must have felt like closure, like the credits rolling on a terrible movie. The truth is messier. There was relief, sure. There was a deep sense of validation. Seeing a judge look at my family and say out loud that what they had done was wrong, and that what I had done to protect myself was justified. There was a kind of quiet satisfaction in knowing that they couldn't just rewrite the story for their church friends and pretend I was the villain who had turned on them. But there was also grief. You don't take your parents to court and watch them get handcuffed without feeling something break that will never fully mend. I had already lost them years earlier in that kitchen, on that night with the broken glass. But this made it official in a way that hit different. It was like signing a final legal version of the goodbye I had whispered into my pillow as a teenager. So what does life look like now? It looks ordinary mostly. I still work at the same company. I moved into a slightly nicer apartment in a building where the neighbors know each other's names and keep an eye out. I have a cat that I adopted from a shelter who follows me from room to room and curls up on my chest when I wake up from nightmares. My friends still park outside sometimes if I text them that I'm feeling weird. But more often, we meet up for brunch or watch dumb shows together and argue about which character is the worst. I set up a system with my lawyer so that the protective order renews automatically as long as the law allows. I don't have to think about expiration dates anymore. It's built into the calendar in a way that doesn't depend on me remembering while juggling bills and deadlines. I still go to therapy. Some weeks we talk about the past. Some weeks we talk about work stress and annoying coworkers, and whether I'm ready to maybe try dating more seriously. Healing is not the straight line. It's more like a spiral where you keep coming back to the same spots from different angles. I haven't forgiven my family. People love that word, forgiveness. They toss it around like it's a magic eraser. I'm not saying I will never get there, but I'm not forcing myself into some pretend peace just to make other people more comfortable. What I have done is forgive younger me, the girl who lied to social workers to stay in a bad house because she was scared of worse. The girl who thought every bad thing that happened was her fault. The girl who stood in that kitchen and finally said out loud what everybody had been dancing around for years. If there's a moral here, I don't know it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything happens for a reason or that trauma makes you stronger. Because honestly, I would give back every ounce of strength if it meant a little girl never had to count scratches on a basement wall to remember what day it was. All I can say is that I'm still here. I have a life that belongs to me. I have people in it who choose me regularly without any blood ties or church reputation on the line. Some nights when I'm closing up the curtains and turning off the lights, I still catch myself listening for footsteps that are not there. I still freeze when someone knocks on my door unexpectedly. I still have to remind myself that I can look through the peephole and decide not to open the door, and that this choice will be respected, not punished. It's a strange thing, learning how to live like a person instead of a problem. If you had told 10-year-old me that one day I would be sitting in a quiet apartment in another state, drinking tea that I bought with my own money, typing out my story on my own old laptop with a sleepy cat snoring beside me, I would have thought you were confusing me with someone else. Someone luckier, someone more deserving. But here I am, not because anyone rescued me in some dramatic way, not because my family had a sudden change of heart, but because little by little, with a lot of help and a lot of messy decisions, I chose to walk away and keep walking, even when the past tried to drag me back. Sometimes I still feel like that kid in the basement, counting marks on the wall and waiting for the door to open. The difference now is that when the door opens, I'm the one who decides whether anyone gets to come in. I know this is a lot to unpack, but that really is how it felt living through all of it. And sometimes I still catch myself replaying small details in my head, like it all just happened yesterday. Little things will set it off, like the way a cupboard door closes too loud, or the hum of an old refrigerator that sounds a little too much like the one in that basement. I can be in the middle of some totally normal adult task, paying a bill online or picking out laundry detergent at the store, and out of nowhere, my brain will throw up some dusty snapshot from years ago that I didn't even realize I still had filed away. Sometimes it's the look on my father's face when he decided I wasn't his anymore. Sometimes it's the sound of the lock clicking on the basement door. Sometimes it's just the way my hands used to shake when I reached for a plate, afraid of dropping it. I wish I could tell you that time erased all of that, but it didn't. Time just layered new memories on top, so the old ones are not the only thing playing on a loop. I talk about all of this in therapy a lot. Not in some dramatic, lying on a couch way, just sitting in a small room with ugly chairs while a woman with kind eyes asks me questions that make me roll my eyes and then cry 10 minutes later. We go over the same stories from different angles, like turning a glass in the light to see where it's cracked. Sometimes I get annoyed and tell her I'm tired of talking about the past, that I just want to be a normal person who complains about work and bad dates and the price of groceries. She always reminds me that I am allowed to do both. That surviving what I survived and wanting a regular boring life are not mutually exclusive. Honestly, that has become one of the weirdest parts of my life now. Balancing the version of me who wakes up sweating from a nightmare about the basement and the version of me who argues with a coworker about whose turn it is to restock the break room snacks. There are days that feel almost peaceful. I get up, feed the cat, drink my coffee, drive to work, answer emails, laugh at dumb jokes in the group chat, come home, watch some mindless show, go to bed. Nothing huge happens. No one screams. No doors slam. The quiet used to freak me out. I was so used to chaos that silence felt like the moment right before a storm. Now I'm learning to let the quiet just be quiet. I light a candle, play some music, let the cat bat at a toy on the floor, and remind myself that boredom is not a warning sign. It's okay for a day to be uneventful. It's okay for my biggest problem on a Tuesday to be that I forgot to defrost something for dinner. Holidays are still complicated, though. That's when the leftover grief sneaks in wearing a stupid festive sweater. There are all these commercials about big happy families gathered around tables, arguing about nothing more serious than who gets the last roll. I watch them and I feel this hollow ache for something I never actually had, which is such a ridiculous kind of mourning. You can't miss what you never got in the first place, right? Except apparently you can, because my chest still tightens when I see those fake cheerful scenes. For a while, I tried to pretend it didn't bother me. I would volunteer to cover holiday shifts at work, so I could just be the office hero and avoid thinking about my own history. Now, I'm trying something different. I make small plans with people who actually want me around. One year, a coworker invited me to her family dinner, and I spent the whole night terrified I would accidentally knock over a glass and get yelled at. But instead, her aunt just laughed and handed me a towel when I spilled soda on the table. It felt like my brain was glitching, trying to recalibrate in real time. I have this little chosen family now, and I don't use that phrase lightly. Friends who know the whole story, not just the polite version. People who have seen me ugly cry in their car, and still text me the next day to ask if I got home safe. One of them grew up in a completely different kind of household, with parents who were strict but loving. And sometimes she will say things like, "My mother would lose it if I talked to her like that." And I have to remind her that losing it in her house meant a lecture, not a fist. Another friend had his own version of chaos. Different details, same tight chest. We trade stories sometimes, not to compete about who had it worse, but to remind each other we're not crazy for the way our brains react to certain sounds or smells. Dating is its own adventure. I would love to tell you that I went through all this, did years of therapy, and now I am emotionally enlightened and pick only healthy partners. That would be a lie. I still catch myself being drawn to people who feel familiar in the worst way. People whose moods shift like weather. People who make my nervous system light up with that old mix of excitement and dread. The difference now is that I notice it faster. I go on a few dates. I hear the way someone talks about their family or their exes. I feel that old tightness in my shoulders. And instead of convincing myself I'm overreacting, I listen. I don't ghost people or blow things up just to prove a point. But I allow myself to walk away quietly before I end up back in a kitchen trying to defend my right to exist. There have been a few kind people, too. People who hand me a mug with both hands, so I don't worry about it dropping. People who say, "Text me when you get home," and mean it. People who don't get weird when I flinch at sudden movement, who ask gentle questions instead of making jokes. I'm not going to pretend I suddenly trust everyone or that I'm ready to pick out wedding colors. But every time I let someone see a little more of the real mess in my head, and they don't run, it feels like I'm rewiring something that was broken on purpose. I still get messages through a social media app, sometimes from people who knew my family back then. Old neighbors, distant relatives, people from that church they joined. Some of them are supportive, saying things like, "I had no idea it was that bad. I'm so sorry," which is a whole other complicated feeling. Others imply that I should let go of the past, or not air family business in public, as if staying quiet would somehow magically make the bruises not have happened. I have a rule now. I don't explain my trauma to anyone who has already decided it is inconvenient. I will not spend my energy convincing them I was hurt. That energy is better spent on making sure I'm not hurting myself anymore. Money from the civil case helped. I'm not going to lie. It didn't fix my brain or erase the past, but it took some weight off my chest. I paid my friends back. I cleared out a chunk of debt that had been hanging over me. I put some of it into a savings account that I call my emergency exit fund, because just knowing I could walk away from any job, apartment, or relationship if I had to makes it easier to breathe. I set aside a portion for therapy so I don't have to panic every time insurance changes rules or raises copays. It's not about revenge spending. It's about finally having the basic security my younger self never got. Every once in a while, I think about that girl I used to be, counting little scratches on a basement wall. I picture walking down those stairs as the person I am now, and telling her that she was not crazy, that it really was that bad, that she's not weak for being scared. I want to tell her that one day she will have her own keys, her own bed, her own friends who show up with moving boxes and pizza instead of with accusations. I want to tell her that she will laugh again, not in that desperate way kids laugh when they're trying to diffuse tension, but in a way that makes her whole chest shake because something is actually funny. She would probably not believe me. I didn't believe adults when they told me things got better. But if I could at least sit with her for a while and let her eat cereal in peace, that would be something. I know there are people who hear stories like mine and want a neat bow on the end. They want to hear that my parents wrote heartfelt letters apologizing and that we all went to family counseling and now spend holidays together in matching sweaters. That is not my story. My parents made their choices over and over again. They chose their pride and their reputation and their version of righteousness. I chose safety, truth, and a life that does not revolve around managing other people's tempers. Those choices are not going to line up into some pretty picture, and I have stopped trying to force them to. I'm not saying I never feel anger. Believe me, I do. Some nights it hits me out of nowhere, and I stomp around my apartment, muttering to myself about how unfair it all was and how much time they stole from me. Other nights the sadness is heavier, and I lie awake wondering who I would have been if I had grown up in a house where nobody ever locked the pantry or the basement door. But then the cat climbs on my chest and starts purring like a tiny lawnmower. Or a friend sends a stupid meme that makes me snort. And I remember that my life is not just a reaction to what they did. It is also built on everything I have chosen since then. I don't talk about the court case much in my everyday life. It's not a secret exactly, but it's not the first thing I tell people when I meet them. If it comes up, I keep it simple. My family was abusive. I got out. There were legal consequences. If they want more details and I feel like sharing, I will. If not, I remind myself that I don't owe anyone a full tour of my scars to be worthy of respect. It took me a long time to realize that I am allowed to set that boundary. I grew up in a house where my body, my time, my emotions, and even my food were not really mine. Now I am trying to treat my story like something valuable, not a free show. Sometimes on really good days, I forget for a few hours that I ever lived any other way. I'll be laughing in a parking lot with my friends, or dancing in my kitchen while I cook, or reorganizing my closet, listening to some random podcast, and it hits me that I feel normal, not on guard, not braced, not scanning every sound for danger, just present. Those little pockets of genuine peace are like proof that the work I'm doing is not just for show. I am never going to be the person who says, I wouldn't change a thing, because there are a lot of things I would change in a heartbeat if I could. But I'm also not going to pretend that the only thing my past left me with is damage. It gave me a kind of radar for cruelty. It made me pay attention to the kids who get quiet when adults walk into a room. It is the reason I donate to shelters and volunteer once in a while at a hotline, listening to people whose stories sound way too familiar. I cannot go back and pull my younger self out of that basement, but I can be one more voice telling someone else that they are not crazy, not ungrateful, not making it up. Those details do not owe me anymore. They are just part of the story, not the whole story. I am still writing the rest, one quiet day at a time, and no one gets to take the pen from my hand ever again, so this is my story, laid bare. It's a lot, I know, but I really wanted to share it because I think a lot of us carry things from our past that shape us whether we like it or not. I found my voice, and now I want to hear yours. Have you ever felt like you had to fight to truly own your own story, or felt like you had to build a new family for yourself? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your thoughts, and maybe your experiences too.